Welcome to Beyond the Backlog, where we look at thrilling tales of gaming triumphs, both past and present, exploring the strategies, challenges, and unforgettable moments that shape the ever-evolving landscape of our digital adventures. I'm Nick.
And I'm Zack.
And today we're going to take a look at something a little different. We're going to take a look at console games and our top 15 Super Nintendo games. It's a cumulative list, so Zack and I each kind of made our own.
I think we each did our own top 20. And then I kind of went through and scored them based on how we ranked them. And overall, we came up with the top 15.
Yeah, and then let us each kind of talk about games that were in our top 10s and then some that kind of combined. An important note before we get into it, though, we've got 6 games that should be either on the list or somewhere close to it. Those being Yoshi's Island, Earthbound, Super Metroid, Chrono Trigger, Mega Man X, and Super Castlevania 4. Those were ones that basically we just hadn't really played.
Yeah, I have beaten Yoshi's Island. I just don't think it's a top 10 for me personally, so it didn't make my list. Earthbound, I was in the middle of playing, and I have now finished. And even after finishing, I don't think it's a top 10 for me personally. But we'll get more into that when we kind of cover what I've been playing over the last month. But the other 4, so Metroid, I would love to actually sit down and play that because it sounds absolutely phenomenal. And the Metroidvania genre is right up my alley. Chrono Trigger is an RPG that a lot of people say is one of the greatest of all time. Mega Man X is just pure run and gun platforming bliss, and Castlevania 4 just kind of, again, that Metroidvania style and a little minor horror themes in there. And I think, again, that's going to be right up my personal tastes. And I'm excited to play those when I do, and I think it would be interesting to come back and see how we'd re-rank them.
Absolutely, with
after
more.
we have played those games.
Yeah, add more to it, kind of gauge our things. It's one of those, we know they're good, we just haven't played them. Don't come after us, really.
That being said, let's jump right in. Number 15. Super Ghouls and Ghosts.
Now, this is one I believe that just hit the cusp of my top 10. And there's a bit of nostalgia with it. It's a platformer, side-scrolling. It's an old Capcom game. Then a sequel to Ghouls and Ghosts, I believe, on the
Ghosts and Goblins.
Ghosts and Goblins, thank you. So one of the two.
I know, that's always so confusing. And I think it just goes to show Capcom at the time of Super Nintendo was pumping out just absolutely fantastic games after fantastic games. I did play an hour of it with you.
Yes.
Way back, I don't know how long ago that was, maybe a year ago. And that first level is hard as balls.
Oh, it's a struggle. Something that I really like about it that a lot of people kind of, contentious with is the jumping, right? You get a double jump, but you've made your choice of what direction. Mm-hmm. So you can do a second jump straight up, but once you've made the choice to jump, you'd have no wiggle room. And I think that's a kind of a fun step to it. I think that it adds a little bit more of a layer to it. You've kind of got to be just a little bit more intuitive on your feet. We were talking, though, just before recording that if we add some of the games we talked about earlier, it is one of those ones that I could see just dropping just below. Because it's fun. It has that nostalgia kick, but you've got to do 2 full playthroughs to really get the quote-unquote story, and I find that just to be kind of draining here in today's day and age, right? So far away from the arcade nature.
I think it's hard to objectively look at it in 2024 and say it was one of the greatest games to have been released in the 90s. Whereas if you were alive and playing games in the 90s, you might have had much more of a connection to it because it would have been one of those cutting edge, mature, difficult games that kind of separated the boys from the men.
Yeah. Yeah, one of those, you were good at Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Oh, man, this guy's a gamer.
Yeah. All right, let's move right into number 14, which is the one that just barely made my top 10, and that is Secret of Mana. Now, my personal experience with this game, I have never actually finished it. I played it way back when I don't even know how young I was, but my uncle and my cousin were playing it, and you can do the 3-player co-op on Super Nintendo, which is wild. So I don't even remember the names of the characters. It's been so long, but my cousin had the double tap, so I was able to be the third player and play the little dwarf guy. I don't actually know what race he is. I'm probably going to get flamed by somebody for calling him a dwarf, but I just remember thinking, this is the most amazing thing, and it looks so good. And even outside of the time that I actually did play it for, which is several hours, I remember watching my uncle play it, like almost from beginning to end, and just being enamored by it. And I know that it would be a top 10 for me personally if I was to actually finish it, because action RPG is just a much faster paced genre than turn-based RPG, and that just clicks with me a lot better. And I did have a lot of experience playing the ported remake of the prequel, which was Mystic Quest on Super Nintendo and Sword of Mana on Game Boy Advanced. And that game on Game Boy Advanced, I played the crap out of, and it's pretty much the exact same style of gameplay, just without the multiplayer.
Yeah, and a couple notes on it too. I haven't personally played the game. I was doing a little bit of research in beforehand. People retrospectively really, really like the music. I think it's one of the best on the console entirely. And it was seen as an early predecessor to a lot of the action RPG elements.
Mm-hmm. And I think if you were going in expecting just straightforward RPG, you're going to come away thinking like, that was nowhere near. But I think if you are trying to get that fast-paced, like, action out of an RPG experience, like something that's a little more like actual numbers and damage and magic based than something like, say, Zelda, but is still like the core of it is you're out exploring in a world and fighting monsters in real time. Like, that is the game for you.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how I will enjoy it, because I am definitely more of a turn-based RPG rather than ARPG, but everything I've heard is great about the game, so
I would suggest we do a co-op playthrough of it.
Yeah.
Even if it takes us like 3 months to do.
That's how it normally works. Busy.
But moving right on into number 13, which is one that I wanted to talk about, and I put a little higher up my list, and that is Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Now, the reason this one really resonates with me is that I only watch like horror movies pretty much. Like, there's 2 types of movies I have that I collect. Scary things and like children's media, like Disney and like Studio Ghibli. And I feel like Zombies Ate My Neighbors kind of gives that perfect Halloween vibe. And ever since I first picked it up, maybe 10 years ago, every single Halloween I've cracked it out, and I have played it through with a friend at the time. And I just love how it spoofs all these different horror themes and monsters throughout it. And like the coordination that is required to actually play it as a cooperative experience is ridiculous, though. And like, there's no way you're going to make it through it on your own.
Yeah, it's a single screen co-op game that you've got to really be in sync with your partner to do. We played it a couple weeks back. It was my first time playing the game. I had a lot of fun with it. It really feels like a good arcade game, if that makes sense. Like, there wasn't an over forcing on, it felt unfair to try to get your coins to get you to keep playing. It just felt like, no, this is a good, solid, you got to know your stuff, and it's just going to keep amping up in difficulty.
And I think 2 points. Well, the first is that it is one that is rewarding to play again and again to learn where, because like things like key drops and like weapon pickups that are just on the ground are static.
Yeah.
So if you play it over and over, you're going to learn where those are, and you're going to find better routes through it with repeated playthroughs.
Now, the neighbors that you collect, are those kind of pseudo-random? They have certain locations that they could be, or?
They have like a priority list, because the whole idea is you're collecting up to 10 neighbors on the first level, and if a monster gets to it first, you no longer are able to collect that on the next level. So In theory, you could only have one neighbor and just blast through level after level, quick, quick, quick. But they do have static spawn points where the neighbors are, but they have a priority list. So it's like you essentially have to make it to the opposite end of the level no matter what to collect it, even if you only have one neighbor.
Okay.
And I think the game is best experienced, second point, as an arcade experience. Like, I don't think you go in with the intent to beat it and see everything the game has to offer. I think it's just you play until you lose and say, hey, that was a fun 30 minutes, 45 minutes. Let's try it again next year.
Yeah, it feels like you kind of build upon it, right? You set the foundation, then the next year you expand upon it, and then you keep going and going.
Because even if you do try and use codes to skip ahead to different levels, you don't have weapons and stuff when you jump into later levels. So it kind of takes away from the feeling of progress, you know?
Yeah, it was one I really enjoyed the time when we played it, but I was fine not beating it right away, and I was fine not doing a second run right after we lost it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a little bit of an investment in time, as I said. Like, it is like a one and done, try it again some other time.
Yeah. But we'll move on to number 12 on our list here. First of the racing games that we've got on the list here.
It's surprising that it's the bottom of our racing games.
Surprising that it's the bottom of the two.
3.
Is it 3? Oh my goodness. 3. Oh, it is 2. Oh my. We've got Super Mario Kart. So Super Mario Kart, for the longest time, in my mind, was one of my favorite Mario Kart games. It still ranks highly up there. I don't really even consider it a great one now. At this point, I think Mario Kart 8 is pretty well the gold standard of how it, quote-unquote, should go. And Double Dash has its weird GameCube quirkiness that always elevates with any type of GameCube-type game.
I think a very telling sign is in our episode where we talked about what makes a Mario Kart track great. We had very few examples from the Super Nintendo. Like, obviously it was influential in just creating a genre, but obviously the first time a genre is presented to the public, it's going to have some growing pains along the way.
Yeah, you really go, why is that in there? Something like coins, right? I've never much been a huge fan of coins in racing games because it's like, do they help you speed up a little bit? Are they just so that they can be knocked out of you if you bump into someone bigger? What is it? It doesn't seem as good as either just racing who can get there the quickest or the item-based one that Super Mario Kart pretty well started, as far as I know. I can't recall if there's any before or around that time for like party racers.
I mean, I might look at something like RC Pro-Am, but even then, that is like a single screen, isometric, single player. Or I think there is multiplayer, but it's rough because if you fall behind somebody, you're essentially being dragged along by the edge of the screen. Whereas this presented itself as like half the screen is yours, but even in single player, you only get half the screen.
Yeah, it's a weird.
And it's strange how they did it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the memories I have of playing that game with other people, with my family, when I was like single digit aged child. Wow, that was more of a tongue twister than it needed to be. Those memories are going to just like continuously propel that game into this like mythical status of like nostalgia where I am always going to love Super Mario Kart.
Yeah.
But I actually recently showed it to somebody who had never seen it before. They hated it.
Oh, I had the same experience. I think it was a couple of years back. Their favorite Mario Kart, I think it was the N64 one. And I was like, man, let me tell you, this Super Mario Kart is great. I like it better. I still like it better. But they tried playing it. They're like, this is just bad. And I was like, okay.
And that's where I think going back now, I have more fun playing the other racing games that are on our list. So I think Super Mario Kart is a landmark title that needs to be on a list of the most important or best Super Nintendo games. I just don't think it's top of the top in mine.
yeah, it's too far gone now. You've had other games that have come out that have really pushed the boundaries, or just what keeps you going back to this versus any of the other Mario Karts, right?
Mm-hmm.
I hope to death every time that a new Mario Kart comes out, they remake some of the Ghost Valley stages because they're great. They're my favorite ones, but I don't think we've had one since the Wii, which I guess is just one Mario Kart game beyond, but...
I mean, they did bring back one of them in the DLC for Mario Kart 8, I'm pretty sure, but
I don't think so.
maybe I'm getting confused with Boo Lake because that was a Super Circuit one.
Yeah, I think there was Bootleg. They brought Donut Plains, and they brought... I think they brought every single one other than Ghost Valley back.
Yeah, but even trying to recreate them now, like there's going to be challenges because they were 2D, very flat courses. But moving on to number 11, which is going to be another racing game and an excellent segue, because what stuck out to me about Top Gear is that I don't know if you've ever played Rad Racer for the original Nintendo, or like Pole Position.
Oh, yes.
Like that idea of it's essentially just blurred lines zooming past you as you're racing forward. But what they were able to do with Top Gear, what Chemical was able to do that Super Mario Kart kind of feels lacking in, is this sense of I'm going up and down hills.
Okay, yes.
And it is very simple. Like graphically, it is very simple. And if you're coming around a sharp turn, there's going to be like a row of like signs pointing left, and like it is almost brainless at times in terms of you don't have to really know the track or react and respond to anything other than cars rapidly approaching in front of you. Like it kind of brings back that essence of, as I said, those older games where the goal is essentially, it is not to memorize a racetrack, but is to avoid the obstacles as they're coming in front of you so that you don't lose your momentum and you don't lose your position that way. But the thing that I find genius about Top Gear is that they add in the ability to like refuel. And so if you are on a long track, you might have to refuel once or twice. And there's actual like strategy in when to do it. And you get 3 nitros as well. So even though it is just very simple, as I said, almost brainless gameplay of just hold A to drive and just left and right around things, I do feel like the years I spent playing that game, because I remember having it when I was a kid. My mom likes telling stories of like that was the game she played over and over while she was pregnant with me, and she got really good, but then I was able to beat her, so suck it, Mom. And it also kind of does the thing that Mario Kart does where it's like you only get half the screen at a time, because even if you're playing single player, you have a rival on the bottom screen. And something about having that rival and seeing that like they do a little bit of rubber banding and seeing that they're approaching me, like really kicks my need to plan out when I'm going to do that pit stop, when I'm going to use my nitros as effectively as possible. Because if both of us peel far away from the rest of the race, there is still a good chance that I'm going to lose or come in like second place because my rival keeps up with you so well.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a huge motivating factor to keep me going and playing and getting better, as well as some of those later races, even on the easiest difficulty. Like I struggle to come in like a top 4 spot, which you need to advance to the next race.
Okay.
Like there's some of them where, and if you run out of gas halfway around the course because you thought you could push it and make that extra lap, then you're just out of luck sometimes. And it's just a very different kind of racing experience from Mario Kart, and a very single player focused one. But I honestly, like, I have a lot more fun going back to Top Gear than Mario Kart.
I think that's fair, because Top Gear hits a little bit more of that competitiveness, whereas Super Mario Kart is very much, and Nintendo had this down in the 90s too, which is just party. It's fun.
Mm-hmm.
That's what keeps people coming back to it.
I think for me personally, Top Gear is my favorite racing game on the Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
Although I will agree with the one that we've placed higher, deserving that spot. And another point, the music is absolutely legendary. And even if you don't have a way to play Top Gear, check out Horizon Chase Turbo, because that is a game that came out a few years ago, and it was the first time since Top Gear where I had that sense of like that's like it feels like what that game would be in like 2018.
Okay, yeah. That's a good one. I just think racing games, there's something just poetic about them. They're just quick, simple, but like it gets something going in you. That's why I understand why people kind of like go fast, right, in their cars. You just got to drive just to see.
And I honestly might be wrong, but I think the people that worked on Horizon Chase were part of the original Top Gear crew.
Okay.
But anyway.
Or the pit. It's like a racing.
I'm not even going to acknowledge that.
So we were getting into the top 10 here, and number 10 is going to be an interesting one that I asked beforehand to Zach if that was going to be something on the list or if it was considered something that's kind of outside the realm, and that's Super Mario All-Stars. And why is basically just they're NES games unless you had the big combo one, which I believe also had Super Mario World on it. But I took it as just NES games plus Lost Levels.
I mean, I think if we included that combo cartridge, that cartridge would probably single-handedly be the best game.
Exactly, yeah.
On the Super Nintendo, even if they are kind of fast to beat games now for a child in like 1991.
Exactly. Oh, it's
legendary.
Oh, exactly. But I figured it was something that had to be on the list as well. Right, because it's all three Mario games, but it also spoke to, even way back then, Nintendo knew, well, if this game did really well, let's port it. Right? Like, they did more than they do now, where they updated the graphics and kind of moved it on to something else, and then giving us Lost Levels that was at the time Japan only because they thought we were bad at games, which we probably were.
Like, I honestly think that All-Stars is the gold standard of what a re-release compilation should be.
100%.
Like, if they did that, like the trilogy of Donkey Kong Country games, or the Top Gear games, or like Zelda 1, 2, up to, oh wait, they did do that on GameCube. Like, those are the kinds of things that we should have, is just compilations of very similar playing games, updated for a new audience,
and it could be its own little video topic. But the idea, I am always pro ports, pro remasters, because it eventually reaches a point where like, okay, but all the old heads kind of compare games that happened beforehand, and all the new kids on the block don't really know what they are. So I do think it's important to keep the history of some of the games going, to be like, hey, here's the new game that's kind of like revamped and redone just to appeal, just to kind of bring it back, right?
Curiosity, though, did you ever play the first three Mario games on the original NES hardware before playing it on Super Nintendo?
Yes. So I never owned Mario All-Stars growing up. But we had an NES, and we had all three of the Mario games on it. So my experience with the Mario games is mostly just the NES games.
Okay, because I had All-Stars, but we lost our original Nintendo when our basement flooded. So I played the crap out of All-Stars and was used to that save system. So when I actually went to try and play like Mario 3 on original NES hardware, I was like, holy crap, like, if you want to beat this whole game, you got to just set aside 6 hours in a day, man.
Oh yeah, especially if you're going start to finish the warp whistles. But yeah, we figured it worked out okay because 10 feels like an appropriate spot to put a game like this, where it is important, influential, but maybe not for the actual gameplay at the time, right?
But it is going to kick off quite a few platformers that are going to saturate this list, like number 9, which is Donkey Kong Country 3.
Oh, it's a great game. I This has always been my second favorite of the Donkey Kong countries. I've never been a huge fan
Spoiler.
Yeah, right? I've never been a huge fan of the first one. Spoiler. But I just think it's fun. It's great to kind of change up and not have to play as Donkey Kong.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll make this one quick because we're going to talk about another one. Spoiler. But I think, honestly, out of the trilogy on Super Nintendo, this is my least favorite personally. That's because I can blow through the first Donkey Kong Country in an hour or less. Mm-hmm. No problem, because I just have that memorized. That being said, I think the scope of the new ideas that they brought into this game is impressive.
Yes.
It's such an ambitious title, but at the same time, it almost becomes too much of everything that they could throw at the wall and trying to see what sticks.
Yeah, because some of the levels are really cool, really interesting, and some of the levels are oh, what are you doing here?
There are some fantastic levels that have just wonderful ideas, but say the one where you're climbing up a waterfall.
Yeah.
And if you fall down the waterfall, I would almost rather just lose a life, but it's you can fall all the way back down to the bottom, and you just know you have to climb up that whole thing again. And some of those kinds of levels stick out to me in not the greatest of ways, but I still really like them. And the note that I made here was that there's a lot of great ideas cobbled together, and the comparison I made was it almost feels like how Banjo-Tooie took the formula of Banjo-Kazooie and is bigger, better, more ideas.
Yeah, and then because of that, it doesn't have that pristine kind of shape that some of the predecessors of it does. I just think maybe it's the theme too, because I remember as a kid playing this one way more than the first one. Even as a kid, I didn't really like the first one. I could never figure out why. Because I can still blow through the game. I really, really like it. I just don't like it as much as the other two.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I think on my personal list, if I was to do a top 15 here, I would replace Donkey Kong Country 1 with 3 in this spot. But I do agree with you that it is a fantastic game, and I think it is one of the best platformers on the Super Nintendo.
100%.
Even if it didn't quite land with me quite the same.
Yeah, which I think is totally fair. But we'll move on to another one that is kind of interesting here. It's number 8. That'll be Demon's Crest.
Oh boy, so this is the one that I have probably the most notes for, so get ready for a little ramble here. But what's your experience with Demon's Crest?
So I tend to do most of the recordings of the clips for the show, and I had to stop myself from playing Demon's Crest once it was done. Because we get a couple minutes in for it, and then I just kind of shorten it down, move it over. But Demon's Crest was just fun. It played like a better Super Ghouls and Ghosts to me from a very initial standpoint. I kind of get what you mean when you said it has very light RPG elements. I got to that by the very end of what I had played. Mm-hmm. But just even going through beforehand, it's a little bit crisper to move. I really like the flying mechanic because I think it just helps kind of shield some of the precise platforming that you kind of have to do with some of the Super Nintendo games.
Mm-hmm. And for those who don't know, in Demon's Crest, you're playing as Firebrand, who is a gargoyle from the Ghost and Goblins universe. And I honestly don't even know what the plot is. There's just you escape from imprisonment, and the fact that the very first thing that happens in that game is a huge boss fight against this giant dragon. It sets the tone so well for what's about to happen. And like I said, get ready for the ramble here, because I'm about to gush about why I think that this deserves to be on the top 10. And it's because, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, it has that kind of Capcom polish, except this one also, you can tell it was published by Nintendo, and it almost feels like somebody there must have had some influence and just, we need to pump this game with some fun. And I think especially the designs of these bosses that you run into are some of the best pixel art on the Super Nintendo and are honestly reminiscent to me personally of the types of like demonic horrors you might encounter in Bloodborne. And just the way that you have this desolate, crumbling city full of like monstrous looking beings that, sell you things like potions and spells that you can use. It is very reminiscent of the kind of style that Bloodborne goes for. And I think if you like the kind of tough as nails difficulty of Bloodborne, but don't really care about this big lore that they have going on, then you're going to fall in love with the world of Demon's Crest. Now, in terms of actually progressing through the game and unlocking things, after the first couple of stages, you can start getting, there's a ground transformation, a water transformation, and an air transformation. And those work perfectly because one allows you to like bust through big piles of dirt and walls and skulls and stuff to uncover secrets and new paths. And like going underwater obviously allows you to go to different locations, and flying in the air allows you to skip over some old levels. So even though you do have to re-enter levels and play through parts of them to get to where the path like branches and diverts, you have new upgrades and abilities that make navigating that level totally different. So I never get bored when I'm playing through this game.
Yeah, it's so hard with some of the older games' replay value, right? Because sometimes it's like a comfort game, kind of like how people rewatch something like The Office, where it's like, I just need something comfortable to play. I'll play, Mario World for the umpteenth time and just kind of go through. Mm-hmm. But to have something like Demon's Crest where you have to be a little bit more aware, and it's like, okay, well, now it just changes it up. It keeps the replay value fresh. And I believe there's 4 different endings in the game as well.
4, maybe.
I believe there's 4.
I've only myself played it through to 3 of the endings. So I'm not entirely sure what the 4th one is. But I think it's also a kind of game where if you are playing through with a guide, you should literally just use that guide as a where to find all of the collectibles and maybe like where the paths diverge, because you don't need a guide to help you through the moment-to-moment gameplay. It's just, once you get a certain upgrade, it's worth going back to an old level with your new upgrade to break down that wall and get an extra life extension. Because the 3 endings that I know of, the first one is after playing through a couple of levels, the final boss becomes available to you, and you could take him on if you want, and you can beat him, but the world will fall into like chaos. The second ending is if you go through and you essentially beat all of the monsters, the big monsters holding crests, and that will allow you to get to like the normal ending when you beat the boss. But if you go through and you collect all those life extensions, you get all of the possible vellums, which are like things that hold your spells, all the urns, which hold your potions, and all of the like different transformations that you can get. Like, you will be overpowered as all heck, but I think it plays perfectly into the secret ending that I know of, where the final boss goes like full Super Saiyan mode and turns the whole screen into this big like cascading wall of fire and lava, and you have to fight him on like moving platforms while he's it's so cool, and it is so worth experiencing to 100% completion. And I absolutely recommend like anyone who wants a challenge from like a Metroidvania style platforming game, you gotta play this one.
Now, when you beat the game with the 3rd ending, you're supposed to get a special password that lets you replay the game. And you get a new transformation with it.
Oh, right. So even when you 100% it, there is one slot that's empty, because when you restart the game after doing that 100% completion, yes, you do get a secret one. And I played through a little bit of the game with that.
Yeah.
But I wasn't going to finish the game again with it because...
Oh, it's a whole new boss.
Oh, well, you know what? I honestly just popped it on the SNES Online.
Yep.
To just play around with a little bit, just to kind of remember. And I literally went to 100% of the whole game because I just had that much fun doing it. As you said, it's one that once you kind of get into it, you don't want to stop.
Oh, it was great. But we'll move on here to number 7. And this is the racing game that I was kind of surprised was the top racing game on our list. Makes sense now in hindsight, though, and that's F-Zero.
I think this is the only one that both of us had on our list.
I believe so.
Because I think I put Top Gear higher, you put Mario Kart higher, but we both had this on our list.
This is our second favorites each. So
it collectively bumped it up.
Yeah, but it's a great game. It's a game, and I gush about this because I've been playing through GX off and on. It's a series that I wish I had growing up, because I would have loved the heck out of this game, because it's just high octane, fast. I've always liked the idea of a lot of extra players in, right? I don't like the idea as much of being like 7 of 8. That just seems kind of silly. But if you're like 16 of 30, for whatever reason, I just really like that more.
And I do like that it has kind of an eliminating the bottom few each lap sort of sense to it, which did play in very nicely to the F-Zero 99 that they released. Because I'm like, that alone allowed them to like retain some of the original elements of what made F-Zero so like cutthroat, breakneck speed, and like obviously it wouldn't work without like the tight controls and this like good sense of like, and so like that speed of like I'm going fast, but I am always in control of my vehicle.
Yes. And then just as a note for people who've never maybe gotten into F-Zero, its whole thing is there's no items or anything like that. It's just you go fast. At the end of the first lap, you get access to your boost, and that boost uses your energy. So if you bump into walls, bump into other cars, you lose bits of that energy. You can boost to use up more of that energy. And then on the track itself are areas that you can go into that aren't necessarily like optimal turns, but you can restore some energy that way. So it's playing the game of how much can I risk boosting? How much do I need to slow down a little bit just to get more of that energy onto your vehicle? And then when can I move and twist people? Because I've done races where you've lost like 10 players.
Oh, yeah.
It's great.
I think something that I like about the Super Nintendo iteration of F-Zero 2 is that it isn't too over the top. As I said, like you have that sense of speed, but also control. Whereas I find the next 2 in the series that went 3D, it's like the camera can whip around so fast.
Yeah, it's very much jarring.
And it does boil down to memorization. And maybe I've just played F-Zero too many times that I have the original track listing like memorized. But it is also like you can kind of gather where you're going just from the outline of the track in the bottom corner.
Yeah.
And I think it's very good at that. But it is also only single player.
Yes, that's one of the downsides of it. I do like, though, the fact that you have to brake at portions. Right? With too many games, you just kind of hit A and then you go and then you just kind of make it work. F-Zero, you've really got to take time to brake around some of the turns or have better ways to do your drifting.
And that's one where I did play the crap out of it, but I could barely win every race on the easiest difficulty. What do they call it? Novice, and then
Novice, Intermediate, Advanced?
Something like that.
I think are the 3.
And it was honestly not until a lot later in my life that I actually played them through on the highest difficulty and found out there was another cup. And that blew my mind. That memory right there of being like, oh my God, I have literally played this for dozens of hours and I had no idea that there was more content to this game because I was never good enough at it. Just goes to show like it is the kind of perfect marriage of skill and technique with just fun, high-octane racing.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's ultimately a little bit higher on the list, because it gives a little bit more than some of the other 2 that really excel at portions. But we'll head on out. We're getting close to the top 5. One that just missed the cut at our number 6, Final Fantasy VI.
How fitting.
Right? It's pretty well compared. Now, it is important to note with Final Fantasy VI, I believe I had it ranked very highly on my list, and I don't believe you've played it.
I have never played it, and it looks like you had it as your number 5, so it's not too far off.
Yeah, not too far off. Just, it's a great one. It's the last one that they did before it got into the 3D Final Fantasy VII, where they really changed up the landscape of how a Final Fantasy game goes. I personally am still a little bit torn on that. I really do enjoy the top-down turn-based RPG. And I was always a big fan of Final Fantasy V growing up, but I had never played 6 until maybe a year ago, year and a half. And it just blew my mind. The story on it's great. Just as a brief preamble, it's a world that no longer has magic, right? It was eradicated or removed. But one of the members of your party, the one that you ultimately control, has access to magic. So it's like, where did she come from? What did she do? She's being controlled by the evil kingdom, and then you break free in the prologue, and then you go throughout the game, gathering party members, defeating evil, and then the really interesting parts go into the villain. The villain of the game is one of the best villains I've ever seen in terms of goals, personality, triumphs. Like, it's real touch and go on if you know if you're going to actually win or not. The story does a really good job with that.
I feel like it is something that Final Fantasy nowadays is known for, but to put it in perspective, the Final Fantasy that I have played is fire, earth, wind, water. Collect those 4 things and then finish the game.
Yeah. I love that Final Fantasy. It's great. But what's really nice about it in comparison to some of the earlier ones is in the earlier Final Fantasy games, you either have your static party members or they rotate out and you don't really know when that's going to happen. So I would always dislike when that would happen, and I wouldn't know about it, right? I'm just a kid. I don't have walkthroughs at this point. I would just get a little bit more upset as like, I bought all this equipment for this guy. I bought all these weapons that only his character class can use, and now he's gone. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't, but it's like, come on. But what's really nice with this one is of all the party members, you get to keep them. And you can rotate in and out pretty well whenever you want. You have to go back to like their home base and then switch up the teams. And there are certain points where you have to split into 3 different teams and kind of command them all. So it very much benefits you training up as many people as you can.
Okay. Yeah, I remember talking about the one time where you said that mechanic was part of what you liked about Final Fantasy VI. And I remember having immediately that question of, is it useful to kind of keep your team kind of balanced in levels?
Yeah, I remember. I think there's at least 3 points where that's the case. Mm-hmm. One of which is like the end game. So it really pays to have everyone. Now, I would suggest walk through with it now just to make sure you get all the characters, because I believe some of them are missable. Some of them aren't.
And does like the main story have like those kind of asinine, you have to talk to this exact person to advance the plot?
I believe so. Yeah. That's just a case of any type of Super Nintendo RPG for the most part, though. It's a struggle. But before the times where they had like icon markers or thinking up, oh, I can just put in the menu, go here, it's a little bit rougher. But I found it cleaner, but I was playing through it at the same time as someone else who knows the game back and forth, so I didn't have an issue with it, but my experience is going to be way different than someone else's. But it's definitely a good one. I think it's my top RPG on the Super Nintendo. But again, like we said, I haven't played some of them, so it's hard to...
Like the fact you haven't played a certain one I'm about to mention?
Yeah, number 5. What's that one again?
Super Mario RPG. Wow. So... This is a perfect example of something that sounds like almost a fever dream. Like, put the same kind of talent behind something like Chrono Trigger's Secret of Mana, or like the kinds of minds that do like Final Fantasy. But like, instead of making a high fantasy world with all brand new characters and villains and story plots, we're gonna pluck Mario out of Nintendo's hands here, and we're just going to throw it into a blender and just add in a sprinkle of humor, a dash of just this unique style that hasn't really been done before or since. And the thing that really sold me on it over other more turn-based RPGs is that timing-based damage output mechanic. Like, you actually feel like you're learning when to press the button to do the maximum damage with your attacks, but every time you swap weapons, it's a different animation that has a different timing to it, so you never get too good at it. And I think that alone kept my interest more than a lot of other RPGs, although I would love to play Final Fantasy VI, and I would love to have a good in-depth conversation about what I like about it, but I just haven't reached that point yet.
Coming soon.
Coming soon to a podcast near you. Other than that, I think Super Mario RPG, the other thing that sticks out to me is that it is a pretty easy game, but that's because it's fun. Like, the priority was on fun, and that's something that Nintendo, with their IPs, is very well known for, as we're going to explore in the rest of the list, which is, I think, is going to be very obvious Nintendo choices.
Yes.
That being said, I think that having the remake of Super Mario RPG on Switch is very interesting, but it does not deter from the quality of the original Super Nintendo game. I think they're like two totally separate products that are both worth playing on their own merits. Like, if you have a way to play Super Mario RPG, it's not on Switch Online, is it? I don't think so, because that wouldn't have made sense if they released a remake. But anyway, like, if you don't have a way to play the original, try it on Switch. If you do have a way to play the original, gotta play it. Just have fun. It's a short RPG that just has so many unique ideas.
Yeah, it's Zack's bread and butter.
Yes. That literally, as we're going to get into with something like Earthbound, like, it took too long to get going, whereas Mario RPG,
quick in and out.
It clicks within 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'm going to say about that is Geno for Smash. I need that to happen. I have been a large believer that would be an amazing thing. Ever since, like, Brawl, I've been begging for that. Before it was a meme.
I get that. I was on the Banjo train. I was super happy when he finally joined.
Oh, that was my number one. And when that happened, I was like, well, now I need a new number one.
Right. And we'll get into number 4 here. That one, I think we both had decently high. It's, again, one of those cumulative added together ones. And that is Kirby Superstar.
Like, I just played it this month in its entirety for the first time.
Interesting.
So, and I love Kirby games.
Yeah.
I just never had it for Super Nintendo. And I absolutely loved it this time around, but I didn't want to jump right in and put it right in, like, the top echelon for myself, because
you gotta let it sit for a little bit and kind of simmer. I love this game. I've played it for years and years and years. I never owned it growing up, though, so we would always play it. We would go visit family, and my cousins had the game. So every time we would do it, before we went and played, like, say, Nintendo 64 with all the 4-player games, we would go through and play some Kirby Superstar, because it's just such a quick, easy game to pick up and go, especially as younger kids, right? And the 2-player system is really nice, because it's something that you can either just not use, you can have the 2-player as the CPU while you're playing Kirby, and it basically just gives you a bad guy that's a friend with you, right? Because you've swallowed him and kind of summoned him.
Well, I love that even when you're doing single player, you can create a buddy to follow you along, and that's something that remains true for, like, all multiplayer Kirby games moving forward too.
Oh, it's great. And I like the replayability of it is pretty nice. Being able to go through a couple different stories as well, right? So you have a couple different, Dynablade one, I believe is the first one. And that's like a short couple stage one that you can do in an hour or two.
Yeah, like, it is a perfect introduction where it's like, if you've never played Kirby before, because it does take a little adjusting to get to this idea of, I can continuously float, like, where's the difficulty here?
Exactly.
But
it's not just about the difficulty.
And I think that's a good introduction. but maybe not. It's not going to like challenge anyone here.
No, it goes into that, and then you get into the Meta Knight saga, and that was just a fun time.
I think that's the Revenge of Meta Knight is probably my personal favorite of the options there, because like that kind of just pushes you to go quick, and you see these little cutscenes in between. It honestly feels like you're navigating through a real world, and the similarities between that and the Subspace Emissary in Brawl.
Very, very similar, yeah.
And I was like, oh my gosh, it all makes sense. Like, it clicked in my brain, because as I said, I've never played Superstar until this month. But like seeing that, knowing that it's Masahiro Sakurai.
Yes.
And especially like the Great Cave Offensive. And I'm like, oh my God, like literally.
That's my favorite.
All of the ideas that he used for single player Smash Bros. Came from Kirby.
Yes. Oh, and it's great. With like, yeah, the Great Cave Offensive, it's like a massive sprawling Metroidvania kind of thing. To be able to get everything, you either got to do multiple playthroughs, or you just have to know, like, okay, at this point I need to ditch this power, pick up this power, get this thing, switch it around. I had a ton of fun playing that as a kid. You had a couple quick plays on it as well. You had the Gourmet Race, which is just a quick little racing game against DDD, where you Gourmet Race, great track.
I was going to say, like, it's a fun little idea, but
yeah, it's not a major.
No, it feels like that one should have been in the little bottom section of just mini games.
The sub games there.
Yeah.
I kind of feel that way with the arena as well.
Mm-hmm.
You had Spring Breeze, which is kind of like a short remake. It's an abridged one of the Kirby's Dream Land, which is still cool. Again, we talked about Dynablade as being a nice introduction. That one kind of hits the same vein. But the other one that was really cool was the Milky Way Wishes.
Mm-hmm. I like that idea of, instead of having to swallow an enemy to take their power, it's like you pull up a menu, and any that you have unlocked, you can swap from at any time.
Yeah, you get to kind of pick and choose. And I think they brought that into it a little bit when you go into some boss battles in some of the later games, and you get to pick from a couple of different abilities to kind of go into, or the one that you've had throughout the whole level.
And I thought that was interesting too, because it didn't really detract from the challenge of it either.
No.
It just kind of allowed you to play with the abilities you want to play as, because you find those fun to play as.
Exactly. But it's a good one. It just missed our top 3, but our top 3 is all heavy hitters.
Oh, yeah.
For reference, I believe each of the 3 games were all top 3s on each other's lists.
False. Mario RPG was my number 3, but Donkey Kong Country is our combined number 3. It was my number 4.
Yeah, this being Donkey Kong Country 2.
Oh, sorry, 2, not 3.
Yeah. But it's a good one. For reference as well, it like almost doubles what Superstar did from our point system. Like the top 3 were very clearly the top 3. But Donkey Kong Country 2, platformer. Not the highest platformer on our list. 3 guesses on which one's higher, but but it's a great one. The theme is awesome. The levels are fun. The music's amazing. I liked the idea. You can't get the idea. I didn't much like playing Donkey Kong. I always played Diddy Kong in the first game, so the second game came out, and it's Diddy and Dixie. Great.
Honestly, and that was the first note that I put here, is like, Donkey Kong Country as a series has tight controls, like better than a lot of the kind of ho-hum run-of-the-mill platformers on the Super Nintendo. And I played a couple of them this month, actually, where I was like, it really made me appreciate how tight those controls are. But from 1 to 2, they went from a character that's fun to play in Diddy, and a character that literally his only strength is that he
kills things better.
Yeah, that he can kill a few heavy enemies, to 2 characters that are equally fun to control for different reasons.
Oh, it's fantastic. I was thinking while we were going through this about why I like DKC3 more, and that's probably it, is that I still get to keep Dixie Kong and her movement.
Mm-hmm. But then Kiddy Kong kind of throws a wrench right back. It's like a worse Donkey Kong, but anyway.
Oh yeah, no, I just played Dixie Kong. Dixie Kong, great.
And like any time I would lose Dixie Kong, I would just find a barrel and then tag back into Dixie Kong.
Yeah, me too. Kiddy Kong gets to get some of the wood and some of the coins. That's it.
And I do love me my simple, repeatable games that I have memorized up the wazoo, but I think Donkey Kong Country 2 improves on that kind of simplistic gameplay of 1, while also making probably the most ridiculous part of 100%ing 1, which is finding all of the randomly strewn about collectibles and bonus barrels. They actually do a better job of pointing you to them with arrows or like screens moving to them, or it's like you can see something in that distance more often, and it's like telegraphing that to the player better, which is why I think I put it above 1 personally.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, it's not a game I like to 100% complete. I think the difficulty in just beating the game is perfect for me.
Yes, and then going into like the Lost World and everything like that's just a little added bonus on top. I find that it's not the go-to. I got to do it every time. Now, the world on it's fun. The themed stages that you get into are really cool. I really like the boss battles. The one critique I maybe have of this game is that a couple of the bosses are kind of the same.
I also don't think that 2D platforming bosses on the Super Nintendo are always known for their technical prowess, but I think...
No, we'll see that later.
Yeah, I was going to say the next game is a perfect example of that, but they do have some cool designs.
Yes. Cool designs. They stuck the landing on the themes.
Mm-hmm.
Who thought the idea of doing a whole like B world would have hit, but it did. I just keep coming back to the thought that the whole game's pirate based, and it's just not. Mm-hmm. It's just one of the most iconic ones for me.
It's like when I'm playing through the first Donkey Kong Country, and then we get to the snow world, and I'm like, oh yeah, we have like 10 levels of this.
Yeah, right? Ooh. I do the same with the water. I was like, oh yeah, we're just like in the water now. Oh yeah, there's octopus.
Mm-hmm.
And then with this game, it's the same thing. It's like, oh yeah, the B world. Oh, there's mine carts. We're in the sky now? Mm-hmm. Why are there brambles here?
But I find even within one world, it tends to present an idea and then iterate on it a few times so that you get better at it. So even in like the like factory kind of world where you're doing a lot of pulling on ropes and then getting through a door before it closes, like by the end, there's some quite tricky platforming challenges you have to make, like gaps you have to jump across, a series of enemies you have to bounce off of in order to make it to that door.
Yeah.
But they start off on the very first stage of that world with just, here's a door, here's a rope, figure it out.
It's very, we don't have tutorials yet, so we're just going to ease you into it and hope you figure it out.
Mm-hmm. So I love the way that game in particular builds on concepts within a world before moving on.
Absolutely. And that, I think, is kind of the case here with number 2 here. We've got Super Mario World. The final platformer on the list.
The final platformer. I don't even know where to start talking about this game because I think most of my thoughts would be reserved for if I was to do if we were to talk about like our top games of all time.
Yes.
Because Super Mario World is my number 1 Super Nintendo game. I put it above the top one, which is surprising if you know my personal interests and gaming preferences, but that is because Super Mario World is the very first game I ever remember finishing.
I had it number 3. It's my fault it's not first.
I know. Darn you. And I think I almost have too much nostalgia for this game to be objective. I've played it probably more times than any other game, including Banjo-Kazooie, which is my number 1 game of all time. I've probably beaten this game more times. To give a perspective, I was writing a 12-page essay yesterday and today, and as a little break for myself, I was playing a few stages in Super Mario World. I 100%ed the whole game in the last day while writing a 12-page essay because I just couldn't stop myself. It's just that good. I think the cape is also the best Mario power-up.
Without a doubt.
And because it gives that that twirl an attack. Like you have a way to fight back with things on your ground level.
Yeah, you're not jumping.
And the fact that if you are flying through the air, it requires some skill and timing. And once you learn that, you can breeze through levels that you used to have to platform through, which is why I'm like, I can't be objective about it anymore. I know what levels I can fly over and which ones I can't. And beyond that, the fact that if you collide with something in air, you don't lose that cape. You just fall, So there's just so much there that just like tickles all the fancies in Zack's personal diet for a platformer. And it essentially shaped the types of games that I like to play now. And to a certain extent, like who I am as a person and my personal preferences.
I think it's one of the most important ones for me being a gamer, right? So my mom, back in the day, before I was even born, she won a contest, and the prize was a Super Nintendo with the Super Mario World box. So it's like, that's the game that she got. That's the console that she got. So growing up, I had that. I had the Donkey Kong Countries. I had the game that's number one on our list. So it's like that singular game could be one of the main reasons why I play games now when I do.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just a good game.
And even like the way they do secrets in that game, and the fact that even just seeing a yellow dot versus a red dot means there's
something else.
Like a red dot means there's two different ways to beat that level. And that just even though I don't remember exactly what the level is, as soon as I see it, I'm like, oh yes, I know this one. I know this one. And when I'm playing other games with other people, they're like, how did you know to look there? Half the time I'm like, I've seen it in Super Mario World, bro.
Yeah.
Like that taught me how to explore game worlds.
Yes. And it's also a good way to complete the games because there's a bunch of different ways you can.
But speaking of games that...
and favorite games.
Speaking of games that essentially taught generations of people how to interact with games, how to explore worlds.
We got Link to the Past.
Number one!
So Link to the Past, as has been mentioned previously, that is my favorite game of all time. There was no way I wasn't putting that number one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we talked very recently about games that took a few tries to get into, and Link to the Past was my game that I didn't have as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I rented once. It wasn't until I picked it up as an adult that I actually played it. So I still think it is objectively... Like I put it number 2 on my list of best Super Nintendo games because I love Zelda, but I don't have the nostalgia for it.
No, exactly. I do, but I see it as well as like from a more historical standpoint, what they managed to stuff onto this cartridge, right? 2 different worlds. You have 12 bosses, I think, between Light World, Dark World, and then Aghanim and Ganon. Like, there's a lot to do.
Oh, yeah. Even if you played like Zelda 1 and 2 and knew there was 8 dungeons in each of those, I still feel like my first time getting to the Dark World, I was like, oh, like they went all out.
Yeah. And like the music changes, the enemies change.
Like I knew, especially because I had already played things like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. I'm like, just because we did 3 dungeons already, there's going to be more. But then seeing there's 6 in the Dark World, I was like, holy crow.
And this is the game that really started that as the Zelda kind of blueprint, right? You do 3 things and then big event happens and then you do the rest of them.
Oh yeah. Like even something like Wind Waker where it's like 2 dungeons, Tower of the Gods unlocks the true rest of the game.
Twilight Princess does that.
Yeah, Twilight Princess.
Ocarina of Time, famously.
Even Skyward Sword. Like, every Zelda game that's come since has used this blueprint.
Yeah, which, I mean, counterpoint, that's why Breath of the Wild was so refreshing. But this is the game that kind of started a lot of those things.
I wish I had played it sooner.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Especially because I love... My favorite Zelda is a 2D Zelda. And did Link's Awakening come out before Link to the Past? I think it did.
I believe it did.
It did. So, and I find Link's Awakening to have such intuitive combat where it's like I get overwhelmed by a bunch of enemies on screen sometimes, but something about Zelda games, I'm able to handle it. And it's also just it's a type of combat in games that I am good at. But I think it took what I was already really good at when I had fallen in love with in Link's Awakening, and it just exploded with it.
We lied. I quickly looked it up here. Link's Awakening came a year after the North American release of Link to the Past.
Well, in my headcanon,
I thought it was earlier. I thought it was 1990 versus 92. It is 1992 for North American Link to the Past, 93 for Link's Awakening.
I was going to say, the only date I knew definitively for Link's Awakening was 1998 is when the color version came, which is the one I had when I was 4 years old.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, Links to the Past. I believe that's the first game I ever beat.
Mm-hmm.
And I vividly remember, because on the screen when you beat the game, it shows you how many times you died. And it was like 512. So I died 512 times, but I beat the thing.
And how long has it been your favorite game of all time?
Probably since then.
It was
like even growing up, going through school, it was always my favorite. Through Pokemon, through Mario 64, it's still just up there.
Yeah, that's where I think my favorite of all time kept fluctuating. There was times where I didn't even think Super Mario World was my favorite on the Super Nintendo because I was like, it's a kid's game. But then I reached a point where I stopped caring. I was like, I just want to have fun.
Exactly. Yeah, well, my top 5 has been pretty well set for the last 10, 15 years. It's very much kicked in nostalgia now, but this game I think holds up now. It introduced a lot of big things, super influential as a game. Not the most influential Zelda game. That's obviously going to be Ocarina of Time. But I do think it's just the best Super Nintendo game.
Mm-hmm. And I think on my list, personally, there's only 2 on my top 10 that I didn't play as a kid that made it on later, and those were Demon Crest and Kirby Superstar.
Yes.
But that just goes to show the power of the memories we have with these games and how our top 15 is largely games that were very formative for us.
Yes, absolutely. Because I would argue that it's the formative console for me, which is really funny because my brother's 4 years younger than me and his was just GameCube. Mm-hmm. Right? So neither of ours is the N64. Which that doesn't really make sense. Mine should be the N64.
Mm-hmm. Getting a little off topic now, and we're going to wrap this up in 20 seconds. But I think for me, I was so halfway between Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64. I had 10 games for each that I personally feel like my formative gaming experience was Game Boy.
Interesting. See, we had Game Boy Color. We didn't really have a Game Boy. So mine was definitely, we had Nintendo. So we had all the consoles growing up. Mm-hmm. It might have taken a couple of years to get them, but we had Nintendo and Super Nintendo before I was born. I remember being a kid and we got the N64 with the Ocarina of Time bundle, as well as Star Wars Pod Racing game and Banjo-Kazooie. Mm-hmm. And then we pretty well just when we could, we picked up all the other stuff. I remember saving money to get the Wii when it came out. But formative is definitely Super Nintendo. Those are the ones that have the most on my top list. Mm-hmm. And then it's probably just GameCube, because that's one that I would play a lot with. My brother had a bunch of gaming experiences with it. And I think I was just old enough to really start retaining all of that.
Yeah, because I did have the Super Nintendo for years before the 64. And as I said, Mario World was the first game I remember beating, but I also got Mario Kart and Aladdin for Christmas. Mm-hmm. But I was only 4 or 5 when we got the Nintendo 64 with Banjo-Kazooie and Ocarina of Time. So I'm I honestly couldn't tell you which of those 2 experiences was more memorable for me because I was so young.
Yeah.
But I will always have those memories of Link's Awakening and Pokemon, Red, Blue, and Gold, Silver on my Game Boy. Anyway, that's a list for another time.
As of now, we've got our definitive cumulative Super Nintendo games.
Plus some rambling.
Comes with the territory. But that's it for today. Next week, who knows what we'll have. Good night, good evening. Take care.
Thanks for listening.